She thought calling the cops would teach him a lesson. She assumed they would show up, question him, maybe scare him a little. But when his mother arrived, everything changed. The officers froze. The woman who made the call went pale, because in that moment she realized she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. What started as a simple phone call turned into something much bigger, a moment that exposed deep-rooted bias, dangerous assumptions, and a power shift no one saw coming. And by the time it was over, she would regret ever picking up that phone. What do you think happened next? Drop your guesses in the comments. Where are you watching from? Let us know below. The air was thick with tension. Margaret Dawson stood frozen, her face pale, her confidence crumbling. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they had just stepped into something much bigger than they had anticipated. And right in the middle of it all, Jamal Carter, a 16-year-old kid who had done absolutely nothing wrong. But how did it come to this? Let's rewind. Just an hour earlier, it had been a completely normal afternoon. The sun was shining, kids were riding their bikes, and neighbors were out watering their lawns. The neighborhood was peaceful, exactly the way it was supposed to be. Jamal, dressed in a simple hoodie and sneakers, stood outside a small convenience store waiting for his friend Malik, who had gone inside to grab a drink. He had his earbuds in, scrolling through his phone, completely lost in his messages. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't looking around suspiciously. He was just existing. But for some people, that was enough to be seen as a threat. Across the street, Margaret Dawson sat on her porch, sipping iced tea, watching the world go by. At first, she didn't think much of the young black teenager standing outside the store. But the longer she watched, the more her imagination took over. She glanced at the silver Lexus parked a few feet away, and then back at Jamal. Her mind started racing. Why is he just standing there? Is he looking at the houses? Is he waiting for someone, or watching for the right moment to do something? Her heartbeat quickened. She had lived in this neighborhood for over 15 years, and she prided herself on knowing everyone. But she didn't recognize him. That was enough to make her feel uneasy. Jamal, completely unaware of the storm building across the street, continued minding his business. He tapped his foot lightly, nodding to the music in his earbuds, enjoying the few minutes of peace while he waited. But to Margaret, his silence looked like secrecy. His stillness looked like suspicion. She grabbed her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Was she overreacting? Maybe. But then again, what if she wasn't? Her thumb moved to dial. Within minutes, the officers would arrive and everything would change. Margaret's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. Was she overreacting? Maybe. But what if she wasn't? What if this boy really was up to something? What if she ignored her instincts and something bad happened? She pushed away the doubt and pressed dial. 911. What's your emergency? Margaret lowered her voice, as if she was witnessing something dangerous. There's a young man standing outside the store on Oakwood Avenue. He's just standing there, looking around. He looks suspicious. The dispatcher paused. Ma'am, what exactly is he doing? Margaret hesitated. That was a good question. What was he doing? Nothing, really, but something about him just didn't seem right. I don't know, she admitted, but it doesn't feel right. Can you send someone to check it out? The dispatcher took down the details and assured her that officers would be on the way. Margaret hung up, her heart still racing. She took another sip of her tea, watching Jamal across the street. He was still just standing there, still just scrolling his phone, completely unaware that his entire day was about to change. Jamal had no idea what was coming. He was just waiting for Malik tapping his foot to the beat in his earbuds, enjoying his favorite playlist. But then, something felt off. The air around him shifted, not physically, but in a way that was hard to explain. He felt eyes on him. Looking up from his phone, he noticed an older woman sitting on her porch, watching him with a deep frown. Her expression wasn't just curiosity. It was something else. Discomfort. Judgment. Jamal had seen that look before. He sighed and looked away, choosing to ignore it. He knew that sometimes, no matter how polite, quiet, or harmless he was, some people would always see him as a problem. But before he could brush it off, the flashing red and blue lights appeared. A police cruiser slowed to a stop right in front of him. Jamal's stomach dropped. 2 officers stepped out. Sergeant Blake and Officer Carter. Their faces were unreadable, their expressions neutral but firm. Jamal's grip tightened on his phone. He knew how this could go. He pulled out his earbuds as Sergeant Blake approached. "Hey, kid," he said, voice steady. "What are you doing here?" Jamal frowned, confused. I'm waiting for my friend. He's in the store." Blake glanced at Officer Carter, then back at Jamal. "Got some ID on you?" Jamal's heartbeat picked up. ID? Why would he need ID just for standing outside a store? ID? "I'm just waiting here," he replied cautiously. Blake's face didn't change. "Someone called in a complaint," he explained. "Said you looked suspicious." Jamal's chest tightened. "Suspicious? Suspicious for what?" He glanced around. The street was full of other people, adults, kids, joggers, but the cops weren't talking to them, just him. And then he saw her. Margaret, still sitting on her porch, watching. Jamal's stomach turned. He understood now. This wasn't about him standing outside the store. This was about who he was and what he looked like. His pulse pounded in his ears as Officer Carter stepped closer. "We're gonna need to run a check on you," he said. Jamal exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. He had been taught what to do in these situations. Stay respectful. Stay still. Don't argue. But as Blake reached for his radio, Jamal could tell this was about to get worse. Jamal could feel his heartbeat in his ears. Sergeant Blake's fingers hovered over his radio, and Officer Carter stepped closer. Jamal had seen videos of situations like this before. He had heard stories. He knew exactly how quickly things could go wrong, even when you were innocent. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. No sudden movements, no arguments, no raised voice. But inside, he was terrified. Blake tilted his head. "You're saying you live around here?" Jamal nodded. "Yeah, I live 2 blocks away. My friend is inside getting a drink. I'm just waiting for him." Carter crossed his arms. "Then why did someone call and say you looked suspicious?" Jamal clenched his jaw. He wanted to say, "Maybe you should ask them." But he knew better. Instead, he took a deep breath. "I don't know," he said evenly. "I'm just standing here." Blake exchanged a glance with Carter. "We're gonna need you to keep your hands where we can see them." Jamal's stomach tightened. "Why?" he asked, his voice careful. "Just a routine check," Blake said. Routine? Since when was standing outside a store suspicious enough for a police check? Jamal wasn't dumb. He knew exactly what was happening. But what could he do? The street felt too quiet now. A few people had stopped to watch, their faces uncertain. Inside the store, Malik was still completely unaware that his best friend was being interrogated outside. Jamal's fingers twitched around his phone. He thought about calling his mom. He knew she would shut this down immediately. But would they even let him? "Sir," Blake said, voice sharper now, "put the phone away." Jamal hesitated. He wanted to hold on to something, anything that made him feel in control. But he knew the risk. So slowly, he lowered his phone. But it was too late. Carter had already moved closer, his hand hovering near his cuffs. Jamal's breath caught. Was he really about to get arrested? For what? His pulse raced as the tension hit its peak, and then the sound of an engine. A sleek, black SUV pulled up to the curb. The door swung open, and suddenly everything changed. The black SUV came to a sharp stop right in front of them. The doors swung open with force, and stepping out was a woman who carried an energy that instantly changed the atmosphere. Tall, confident, dressed in a navy blue blazer and heels that clicked with authority against the pavement. And Jamal exhaled in relief, because this wasn't just anyone. This was his mother, Dr. Vanessa Carter, one of the top attorneys in the state, a woman who fought battles in courtrooms and wasn't afraid to take on anyone who abused their power. And the moment Sergeant Blake saw her, his expression shifted. Officer Carter took a small step back, suddenly looking a little too stiff. And Margaret Dawson, the woman who had made the call, she went completely pale, because in that moment, she knew. She had just called the police on the wrong kid. Jamal barely had time to react before his mother was standing between him and the officers, her presence commanding the entire scene. "What's going on here?" Her voice was sharp, steady, demanding answers. Blake hesitated. We received a call about suspicious activity." His voice wasn't as strong now. Dr. Carter narrowed her eyes. "Suspicious activity? You mean my son standing outside a store, waiting for his friend?" Officer Carter cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we were just doing a routine check." Dr. Carter let out a short, humorless laugh. "A routine check? On a teenage boy waiting for a friend? Or did someone just decide he didn't look like he belonged here?" Neither officer spoke. Margaret shifted uncomfortably on the sidewalk, trying not to make eye contact. Dr. Carter turned to her son, checking him over like a mother does, making sure he was okay. Then she looked back at the officers. "I want to know exactly what was said in the 911 call," she demanded. Blake hesitated. "We can't disclose that information." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Oh, you can't?" She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. "That's fine. I'll just call the police commissioner. He and I have a meeting next week anyway. I'm sure he'd love to know why his officers are harassing innocent kids in broad daylight." Blake's entire posture shifted. Officer Carter's mouth opened slightly, as if realizing how badly they had just messed up. And Margaret? She looked like she wanted to disappear, because this wasn't going the way she expected. Jamal watched it all unfold, still stunned. One moment, he had been seconds away from being handcuffed for no reason. The next, the officers looked like they wanted to be anywhere else but here. His mother stood firm, her presence completely unshaken. And Margaret, the woman who had thought she was protecting her neighborhood, she was realizing something she had never expected. She wasn't the one with the power here. Margaret Dawson stood frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of her porch railing. She had been so sure that she was doing the right thing, that calling the police on Jamal was justified. But now she realized how badly she had miscalculated. Dr. Vanessa Carter, Jamal's mother, stood tall, her presence dominating the space. The two officers, who just moments ago were in full control, now looked uncertain, hesitant. And Jamal, he felt the shift. For the first time since the officers had arrived, he saw something different in their eyes. Doubt. Because they knew exactly who they had just messed with. Dr. Carter's voice was calm but razor-sharp. "So, let me get this straight," she said, folding her arms. "A woman calls 911, says a black teenager standing outside a store, looks suspicious. And instead of questioning the caller, you show up and treat my son like a criminal." Neither officer spoke. The silence was deafening. "Well?" she pressed, her eyes locked on Sergeant Blake. "Where's the explanation? Where's the reasonable suspicion? Because last I checked, waiting outside a store wasn't a crime." Blake shifted uncomfortably, his hands resting near his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to subtly remind everyone it was there. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "we were just following procedure. We got a call, and we had to check it out." Dr. Carter let out a humorless laugh. "A call based on what? A feeling? A hunch? Or was it just another case of assuming a black boy doesn't belong?" Margaret felt the heat of Dr. Carter's gaze on her, but she couldn't bring herself to speak, because deep down, she knew. She had no real reason for calling the cops, no evidence, no justification, just a gut feeling, one that had turned into a public embarrassment. Dr. Carter finally turned to her. "You called the cops on my son," she said, her voice measured. "Tell me, Margaret, what exactly did you see that made you think he was dangerous?" Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. Her mind searched for an answer, something, anything that would make her decision sound logical. But there was nothing, because the truth was ugly. And now, everyone saw it. Officer Carter cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Look," he said, trying to salvage the situation, "we didn't mean any harm. We were just doing our job." Dr. Carter's head tilted slightly. "Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not to escalate situations based on weak assumptions. My son was standing outside a store, waiting for a friend. That's it. If he were a white teenager, would we even be having this conversation?" The officers didn't answer. Because the truth, they knew the answer. And Dr. Carter, she knew it too. Jamal watched as Margaret looked away, her face red with embarrassment. The officers stood there, no longer in control. And for the first time since this started, Jamal felt seen. His mother had flipped the script. The power that had been used against him just minutes ago was now completely in his favor. And Margaret, she had no choice but to face the truth. Margaret Dawson looked away, her face flushed with embarrassment. She had no explanation, no defense, no way to justify what she had done. The officers stood silent, avoiding eye contact. The weight of the situation had fully sunk in. And Dr. Vanessa Carter, she wasn't done yet. Dr. Carter's gaze stayed firmly locked on Margaret. "You called the police on my son," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "Now that I'm standing here, tell me, what exactly did you think he was doing?" Margaret opened her mouth, then hesitated. Everyone was waiting for her answer. The officers, Jamal, the people who had gathered nearby, watching everything unfold. She could feel their eyes on her. Her throat felt dry. She glanced down at her hands as if searching for an excuse. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter took a small step forward. "You just what?" "You saw a black teenager standing outside a store, and instead of minding your business, you assumed the worst. You didn't see a kid. You saw a threat." Margaret flinched, because she knew that was exactly what had happened. And now, she had to face it. Dr. Carter turned back to the officers, her expression unshaken. "You see a young black man standing on the sidewalk, and suddenly he's suspicious?" she challenged. Blake shifted his weight, his confidence from earlier completely gone. "Ma'am, we were just responding to a call." "A call based on nothing," she interrupted. "And instead of questioning the person who made the false report, you came here ready to treat my son like a suspect." Officer Carter exhaled, rubbing his forehead. The tension was unbearable. Because she was right. They had walked into this situation without thinking, without questioning, without considering the reality. And now, they had to face the consequences. Margaret finally spoke, her voice shaky. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Dr. Carter's expression didn't soften. "You didn't mean to. Do you have any idea what could have happened to my son today because of your call?" Margaret looked down, guilt washing over her. Jamal, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke up. "You didn't even ask me anything," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You just assumed." Margaret swallowed hard, because hearing it from him, the boy she had falsely accused, hurt the most. She had been so sure she was doing the right thing, but now she realized she had only exposed herself. Dr. Carter took a deep breath, looking at everyone. The officers, Margaret, the growing crowd of witnesses. "You know what the worst part is?" she asked. "This isn't new. This happens every single day." The officers stayed silent. Margaret looked like she wanted to disappear, and Jamal just stood there, watching it all unfold, because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something much bigger. Margaret stood there, speechless. She had never felt this kind of embarrassment before. The weight of her mistake was heavy. She had called the police on an innocent teenager, and now, in front of everyone, she had no excuse for it. She glanced at Jamal, the boy she had falsely accused. His face wasn't angry, but it held something even stronger, disappointment. And that was worse than anything else. Dr. Vanessa Carter exhaled slowly, her sharp gaze sweeping over the officers, the crowd, and finally, Margaret. "Let me make something very clear," she said, her voice steady but powerful. "My son doesn't owe anyone an explanation for standing in his own neighborhood." The officers shifted uncomfortably, but they didn't interrupt. They couldn't. They had already lost this fight. Dr. Carter turned to Jamal and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," she told him. "You belong wherever you choose to be." Jamal nodded, taking a deep breath. Her words meant everything. She turned back to the officers. "Are we done here?" Sergeant Blake nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am." The officers knew there was nothing more they could do. They had acted on bias, and now, standing in front of a woman who understood the law better than they did, they had no choice but to back down. And just like that, it was over. Margaret took a small step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for this to happen," she mumbled. Dr. Carter turned toward her, arms crossed. "Didn't mean to," she repeated. "That's the problem. You don't think before you act, and people like my son pay the price." Margaret's face burned with shame, because Dr. Carter was right. She had never questioned her own actions, never considered what her fear, her assumptions, could do to an innocent person. And today, she had nearly ruined a teenager's life over a gut feeling. She opened her mouth to apologize, but what could she even say? Nothing would change what she had done. Jamal took one last look at Margaret, then at the officers. He had been seconds away from being in handcuffs, seconds away from becoming another statistic. But his mother, she had stood up for him. She had reminded them all that he deserved to be here, just as much as anyone else. And that meant more than anything. Dr. Carter turned to her son. "Come on, let's go." Jamal nodded, stepping into the black SUV. His mother followed, closing the door behind them. And as the car pulled away, Margaret stood frozen, watching them disappear. Because this was a lesson she wouldn't forget. The street went back to normal. The neighbors who had been watching slowly walked away. The officers got into their cruiser and drove off. But one thing was clear. This moment changed everything. Margaret had been so sure she was doing the right thing, but in the end, all she did was expose her own bias. And now, she had to live with that truth. Because next time, the person on the other side of the assumption might not be as lucky as Jamal.